Right, so let's kick off. So you're very welcome back to week 5 of the course, the final week of the course. We were just having our team meeting there before the meet before this, and I think we've all just really enjoyed this course. I've really enjoyed it. I think it's been one of the most enjoyable courses I've done, actually. It's the first time I've done it, so it's been great traveling this journey with you on the course. And we have one more week then before we finish. So, to give you a sense of what we'll do tonight, as usual, I'll just share my PowerPoint. And let me get my pointer set up here. So tonight we'll do a recap of last week, including the home practice. Basically, I'll remind you of everything we did last week. We'll do home practice groups, so you can check in about how you got on during the week. Whoops, that's going a bit out of sync, sorry. We'll look at the theme for tonight is winds from the West, so particular strong winds that we have to deal with, which maybe the Buddha didn't have to. And this is corresponding to chapter 5 of the book, Vajragupta's book. And in particular, he looks at two prevailing stories, as he calls them, or views, which he's called scientism and consumerism. So we'll come back to that again, and how they really do contribute to the blowing of the worldly winds in our modern lives. And also then how we can respond to these modern winds. And we'll do some reflection on the course, and then we'll have some final groups to basically to check out. Check out in our circles means like to just tune in with how the course has gone with each other, and then to set our intentions for what we want to do after the course. Yeah. So let me just. Oh yeah. So before we do the reminder of last week, let's just arrive spend a few minutes just arriving, because it's good to if you've come from a busy day or you're working on screen a lot like I have today, it can be nice just to do even just a few minutes of meditation. So just sitting comfortably, setting yourself up in whatever way is most comfortable for you. Kind of what most a blend of what's most convenient and what's most comfortable, you could say. So when you're ready, just closing your eyes, maybe taking a deeper breath or two, and just kind of loudly exhaling out. Breathing in deeply all the way down to our belly, and then loudly exhaling out. And one last time. And when we breathe in this time, as we breathe out, keeping the openness across the chest. And we'll just spend a bit of time focusing on our posture now. So just making sure that we're not slouched. Our chest is open across the front. If anything, our back could be concave rather than convex. In other words, the opposite to slouched. So moving your shoulder blades back and towards each other to give that uprightness. You might like to imagine a string from the top of your head to the ceiling, pulling the back of your head upwards. So your crown is rising towards the ceiling. The back of the neck is long. You can ever so slightly move the chin down, tuck the chin down. Not to your chest, just a small amount, just to extend and release the back of the neck. And now that we have this uprightness and alertness, we relax into it. So we keep the alertness and the uprightness, but then we relax as well. It sounds contradictory, but it's possible to have a relaxed uprightness. And you can help with this by imagining your weight just sinking more into the support of the chair, the cushions, allowing the chair, the cushions, the floor whatever you're sitting on, to more fully take your weight. And if you feel your posture is in any way awkward or rigid, just relaxing that. And then just opening to the body. Really, it's just about letting it in. It's almost like we open a door to the body and let all the feelings in. Let ourselves feel them. Even if they're painful. Even if we have resistance, just trying to soften that resistance and open up to what's there. You can breathe with this if it's helpful to do so, but not focusing exclusively on the breath, keeping the awareness of the body, allowing in the body. And how does the body feel? Particularly from the chest down, from the shoulders down. Is there alertness and energy or tiredness? Is there a degree of ease and comfort and pleasure? Or is there tightness, unease, pain in the body? Are we open to what's there, or are we trying to keep it at arm's length? Using the breath lightly as an anchor if we're in any danger of drifting off. But continuing to open to the body. Bringing our attention down into our legs and into our feet. How much sensation can we feel in our feet? There can be a lot of energy here, just like in the hands. Can we be open to what's going on in the feet? How many toes, how many individual toes on each foot can we feel? I'm not worrying if we can't feel many. It's more about being interested and being open to them. And then finally coming back to the heart and the guts. And for the last few moments, just following the breath in, the breath out, in our heart center, in our chest, in our stomach. And with each breath, taking in fresh energy to rejuvenate us so that we can study the Dharma together again with each in-breath. And with each out-breath, just letting go of the day that's already been so we can be fully here, or at least more fully here. Letting go of any sticky incidents from today, or regrets, or lingering uncertainties. Just letting them go. If they're important, they'll come back again some other time. And then when you're ready, starting to bring the practice to a close, wiggling fingers and toes and becoming aware of the sounds in the room around us. And in your own time, bringing the practice to a close. Okay, so welcome if you've just joined us. A few people have just joined there, and that's it. So you're very welcome again to week 5 of the course. So we've already looked at what we'll be doing tonight, or at least we've looked at the overview of it. Just to remind you of what we did last week, just before we go into the breakout rooms. Okay, so what we did last week, we had the worldly, the wisdom perspective on the worldly winds. Yeah. So we had been looking in week 2 at it in terms of our behavior, our ethics. In week 3 in terms of meditation, and week 4 in terms of the wisdom perspective. And in particular, we were looking at what are called in Buddhism the 3 marks of conditioned existence, the 3 characteristics of life, you could say, of everyday life at least. And there was impermanence, that all things change. Especially the worldly winds and our stories about them. They didn't have any lasting quality to them. Anything we label is just a label, and things are much more mysterious than that. And they were also, because we don't see impermanence and insubstantiality, we experience dissatisfaction or suffering, or dukkha is the Buddhist word. So these are ways that we can reflect that help us get over the stories of the worldly winds. And maybe it's important to say as well that reflecting on these usually is meant to bring freedom and beauty and joy. Sometimes when we hear about suffering and change and impermanence, we only think of the negatives, but there's a lot of positives to these as well that can be brought out. And you can talk about that in your group as well if you need to. And then we also looked at ethics, meditation, and wisdom as the path to freedom. And we were working with what Vajrashura called, well, the Buddha called actually, the 3 obsessions: craving, so wanting things to be other; conceit, which is where you compare yourself to other people unhelpfully; and then ignorance, which is the delusion that by playing the worldly winds, you can win at life somehow. So craving went with gain and loss and pleasure and pain, and conceit went with fame and infamy and praise and blame. Yeah. And then the home practice this week was to read chapter 4 of the book. Continue to work with the worldly winds. So in terms of our ethics, our actions, the Dharma doors and so on that we'd studied before, to try and meditate every day if you could. And then note the impermanence of the winds. Do any of the wisdom perspectives, but particularly note how the stories we tell ourselves about the winds and the winds themselves are very impermanent. One minute we're craving pleasure, the next minute we're fighting pain, and so on. Yeah. And then if you can, let people know on Slack how you're getting on. Okay, so that's it for the home practice. If you just give me 1 minute, I'll put those in the chat so that we can bring them into our groups. Okay, so in terms of the groups this week, unfortunately Kelly can't make it because she's ill at the moment. She's come down, she's not feeling well rather, and Kieran has been traveling, so he can't make it. So if you're in Kieran's group, that's Kieran Green Oak, you're going to go to Sam White Book. Okay, so if you're in Kieran's group, normally you're going to go to Sam's group. And I think if you're in Oscar's group, Oscar is here, Oscar Green Bell, you're going to go to Kelly's group instead, Green Grass. Stephen, that's right, isn't it? To give the thumb. Yeah, great. So again, if you're in Kieran's group, go to Sam's group. Kieran Green Oak, go to Sam White Book. And if you're in Oscar's group, Green Bell, go to Kelly Green Grass, so different green. And we'll do this for 15 minutes. And Stephen, whenever you're ready, you can invite us to the groups. So at the bottom in a moment, the breakout rooms will come up, and you can. Will you give me a thumbs up when that's ready to go, Stephen? Because I can't. Yeah, it is there. Okay, so you should be able to join your groups now. Okay, so so those were the breakout rooms. I hope you had a good chat there. We had a good chat in ours. And with all this stuff, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. We'll have a chance. I think what we'll do is we'll have a chance after the tea break if you want to ask any questions, but stick them in now and I might stop here and there. And you can also put questions in the Slack as well, and you might get me answering or any of the other guys answering as well. It'd be great to hear from you there. Okay, so what I wanted to talk about next is about the final, well, the second to last chapter of the book, which is about winds from the west. So and there's a lot of material in this week's stuff, so I'm not going to try and cover it all in great detail. You could read more about it in the book afterwards. But yeah, so let's see how long I'll talk for. I'll probably talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll try and do a reflection or something. So we live in a very different world from the Buddha. In a way, one of the things I've been really struck with on this course, and you get this particularly at the back of the book. If you turn back to the book, at the back of the book, you can see the Buddha's teaching on the worldly winds. So you can, sorry, I'm not sure how easily you can see that. So you can read the text where it comes from, and it's a bit, the text of Pali Canon where it comes from, it can be a bit repetitive and so on because it's taken from an oral tradition. But it's really interesting anyway, and it's surprising just how fresh those basic teachings are and how relevant they are. And at the same time, we live in a very different world to the Buddha's world. Particularly in the last 250 years, the world has dramatically changed. And so much has changed in terms of how we live, how we work, how we produce materials, how we eat, how we communicate, how we relate to each other. And the Buddha didn't have to deal with many of the kind of winds that we deal with now, even though I think the Buddha's teachings for how to deal with those winds is still relevant. Yeah. So just to say that I'm not knocking any of modern times. I'm really grateful for all the scientific progress that we've made in these last few hundred years in particular. I'm really grateful that modern medicine does what it does, and we don't die in our 30s on average anymore, our life expectancy. I remember reading a book about how, in the Middle Ages, 1 in every 3 women would die giving birth to their first child, for example, which is a rather shocking figure. And these days it's just so much better than that. I'm so grateful that, we don't have, well, we have a kind of a Spanish influenza, but it's not anything like the same scale, hopefully, in most of the world anyway. I know there are parts that are really bad. And the speed at which vaccines have been rolled out, even though, it can get frustrating at times waiting for them, it has been quite remarkable, actually. I'm really grateful that we have the internet, which has huge drawbacks, but actually it's amazing what we can learn about on the internet. All of like human history, all of human knowledge pretty much is available on the internet to any of us now. And that includes the whole of the Buddhist tradition as well, in a way that you never would have in the past. Even 50 years ago, you would have been dependent upon a small number of books that would have been hard to get to learn about the Dharma, you know. We've huge awareness of things all across the world. You know, you can chat to family members in Australia and things like that. There's huge amounts of freedom from like the kind of manual labor that people in the Buddhist day would have to do all the time. And increasingly, well, in principle anyway, increasingly we have more and more free time. I don't know if it quite works out that way. We have mass literacy, mass education. And we have a huge human population, perhaps too much in some ways for what the earth can support. And we also have, incredible food networks to supply such a wide variety of foods to stay healthy. So there's a lot to be rejoiced in the modern world, yeah. And there's also a lot to be concerned about in the modern world as well. You know, the sheer scale of suffering in the world. I think one of the main things about the world is that we're put in touch with all the problems of the world nowadays, like never before. And at the same time, it's not clear how we can do anything about those problems. So we hear about an earthquake halfway across the world that we never would have heard about before, but not sure what to do about it. We hear about the pandemic causing chaos in India. You know, lots of our orders in India, and we have been raising money for them. I think we've raised about nearly 200,000 in our community for them, euro for them. But, you know, so there are things we can do, but it always feels not quite enough given the scale of what's presented to us. Or I've been looking at what's going on in Gaza with in the conflict there over the weekend in particular, and been very upset by that, and really not sure what I can do about that in the face of the powers that be. In terms of the suffering and the killing and the death and the oppression that's going on there. So, there's a lot to be concerned about in the world, and we're brought up against it very, very immediately and very, very quickly, but without the corresponding tools to know what exactly we can do about it. Other examples would be, climate change, which is a deep concern of mine. Other things would be misinformation, nuclear weapons. Anyways, I won't go on because I'm sure you don't need me to depress you about it all. But you get a sense that, the modern world has many wonders, and technology has many wonders. So I'm just going to open my windows again. And at the same time, lots of new challenges that the Buddha wouldn't have had to face in his day. And in week 2, we looked at the importance of stories, the stories we tell ourselves. And the stories that we tell ourselves, you could say our views is what Buddhism traditionally calls them. But the stories that we tell ourselves, they contain certain assumptions about our lives and how we think we will find happiness. Yeah. So a strong story, for example, is if I have this thing, I will be happy. Or another strong story is, I need this thing, or that's kind of a similar version. There's lots of different stories that we can tell ourselves. And these stories then have these assumptions built in, the assumption there being that things can make us happy, for example. And these stories then become habitual. So the more you do a worldly wind based upon that story of the worldly wind, the pair of worldly winds, the more entrenched they become and the more they shape our world. So the more caught up in gain and loss you are, the more you see the world in terms of what you have and what you don't have. And the more you see the world as somewhere to get what you want and avoid losing what you don't want. Yeah, and that's how you see the world, and that's how you see other people, and that's how you influence other people. It's almost like we suck other people into our stories when we interact with them as well. Yeah. So if you're around a bunch of people who are all very concerned with gain and loss, you will get sucked into the winds of gain and loss too, most likely. So stories are really important. The Buddha talked endlessly about stories and the importance of recognizing our stories. And Vajragupta explores 2 prevalent stories in modern times, yeah. And the 2 stories are what he calls scientism and consumerism, yeah. I don't have a slide to share because there isn't really anything succinct to share on a slide, but scientism, like science, but slightly different, and consumerism. Yeah. And in talk, so I want to talk about each of these, and we'll do a reflection on some of them. So just looking at scientism first. So, well, looking at them both. Sorry, first summarizing them. Scientism is an explanation of the universe, what the universe is and how it came to be, and then consumerism, you could say, is the story of how we find happiness within that universe. Yeah. So scientism kind of sets the scene and tells us how we got here and how it works. And then consumerism tells us how we then gain happiness within that universe. And Vajrashura calls these the modern religions. The modern religions, yeah. And these modern religions are so part of the fabric of modern society. It's almost like being a fish in water. We don't see that they are the waters in which we swim, yeah, so strongly. And they fill the gaps, you could say, left behind with the death of the old faiths, the old, particularly Christian faiths in the West, I guess, And we tend to, Marx had a very interesting aphorism or saying. He said that the dominant ideology is still an ideology. Yeah, so I'm not proposing Marxism, by the way, in case anyone panics, but he does say that the dominant ideology is still an ideology. I think what he meant by that is that when we have a worldview or a story about how the world is, or an ideology, we don't think of it as a story or an ideology. We think that it's just how things actually are. And every other person's view is an ideology. Yeah. So it's worth remembering that every story we have about the world is still just a story. And no story, according to the Buddha, can really point out the true nature of things. We have to be radically open to something much, much more mysterious. And worldviews, ideologies, or whatever you want to call them, they tend to be self-perpetuating and self-reinforcing, and specifically reinforcing the status quo of their story. Yeah. So anyways, there's a load there. I mean, you could give a whole 6-week course on that last paragraph, and we could do a whole course on views, I have to say. And again, the Buddha talked endlessly. I'm summarizing so much of Buddha's teaching into that paragraph. And I'm largely working from what Vajrashura sparks off. So in terms of the worldly winds, what these are saying, what these prevalent modern views of scientism and consumerism, and I'll define them more carefully in a few moments, what they're saying is that true progress, true material progress, we can make a perfect world where we only experience the positive winds and we don't experience the negative winds. So we only experience gain, pleasure, praise, and fame, I think is the one I left out. So we can shape the world so that we only experience those, and we don't have to experience the negatives of loss, infamy, pain, and blame. Yeah, so that's really what these modern stories are trying to tell us, that we can shape the world so that we only experience the positives of the worldly winds and we don't experience the negatives. Yeah, so that's really the core of tonight's message. That's what these views offer. And are they right then? Can they do this? And it is worth asking ourselves, do we believe that they can? Because to some degree we've taken on that. It's in the society, it's in the air. And it's up to you to decide that. Don't just take it because I'm saying it. But the Buddha did say that was the case, and I'm going to go with the Buddha on this one, yeah? Shock horror. The worldly winds can't be controlled. Yeah, the worldly winds can't be controlled. We probably need to have that tattooed backwards on our forehead, so to speak, so that we see it every time we look in the mirror. Yeah, the worldly winds cannot be entirely controlled. And these modern stories that we have about the worldly winds tend to create and perpetuate an unhelpful story or an unhelpful myth, an unhelpful illusion about what's possible. Yeah, it's not to say that we shouldn't work to improve the world and improve medicine and improve technology. And, I really like science. I'm a theoretical physicist by training myself. I still read, a book. I'm reading, this book at the moment by Carlo Rovelli, which is about, quantum mechanics and stuff like this. I'm so fascinated by science. I'll come back to that book in a minute. And I'm really grateful for my smartphone, and I'm really grateful for my consumer toys that I like. I'm grateful that we can talk to each other on Zoom, which is the product of a consumer culture, you could say. But it's not so much the things themselves, or it's not so much science itself, for example. It's the dogmatism around the views of it that is the problem, and the expectations that they create, that we can get rid of the unpleasant wins and can only have the pleasant wins, you could say. And if you're going to be serious about practicing the Dharma, we need to have a critique of all stories, yeah, even Buddhist ones in a way. So yeah, we need to have a critique and have a deeper sense of what life is really like and what life is really about. Okay, hope you're okay so far with all that. Okay, so I'm going to say a bit about science and scientism. So science, you could say, is a way of observing and understanding the objective world, objective in quotation marks, or the material world, if you want. And I run a whole course on Buddhism and science, and I don't think we have one planned, but it'll probably be running in January of next year. So if this is an area that grabs you, you can come back to that course. I know some of you have probably done it already. But science gives us the knowledge to kind of control and shape the world to our advantage. And it gives us technologies, like all the ones I mentioned, like medicine and phones and communications and the internet and all these kinds of things. So it definitely allows us to shape and to a certain degree control our world. And then what Vajragupta defines as scientism is this ideology about science and its role in our lives, yeah? So it's kind of like the belief that science is the only complete explanation for things, and it can be the only explanation for things, and it's inevitable that science will explain everything eventually. Everything will be explained in terms of physical matter. So you get this, for example, in many schools of study of the mind. So consciousness, the mind, is simply a byproduct in hard scientific materialism, in scientism. It's an epiphenomena of the brain, basically. What it means is that as the brain comes to a certain degree of complexity, consciousness arises, but there's nothing more mysterious to it than that. And it's pretty much like a glorified machine, yeah? And there's all kinds of interesting discussions that can happen around free will and all that kind of thing. But Buddhism would say that the nature of consciousness is much more mysterious than this. And it would also say, I'm not going to go into this in huge detail, I'll just leave it out there tantalizingly, that consciousness is primary. And matter is more something that arises with the arising of consciousness within certain conditions. Yeah, and consciousness continues beyond death and through different lives. Now, what Buddhism talks about as consciousness isn't necessarily what we might think of as us, because that's a bit of an assumption as well, and we're much more mysterious than that. Anyways, you can ask me questions about that later if you want. But one of the phenomenons of scientism, which I'm sure you've come across, is movements like, the new atheism by certain scientific writers, which have been quite helpful in a way in pointing out the corruption of many traditional religions. And I've actually enjoyed reading some of those books. I'm sure you've come across books like The God Delusion and things like this. But they don't tend to talk about how science has led to so many problems as well. Nuclear warfare, ecological collapse, widespread mental health issues, and so on. And my experience of looking at science is that science tends to gallop ahead of our ability to ethically understand the implications of science. Yeah. So scientific developments tends to gallop far ahead of the ethical implications of what that'll mean for people's lives. And I find it really interesting that in my 6 years of studying science in Trinity, I did an undergraduate degree in theoretical physics, and then a master's in high performance computing, and eventually crashed out of a PhD when I became more interested in Buddhism. In all that time, I never did one single class exploring the ethics of the scientific process. We'd hardly even studied the scientific process itself, never studied the ethics of it or how to assess the implications of what we were studying. Yeah. And I think when we talk about scientism as a kind of a dogma, it tends to see science as just purely good. And I think we need to be, again, careful, because, when you think about things that have had so much effect on us, like let's take the internet and social media. It's been so good. Social media has been so good for helping people stay in touch with each other, and seeing pictures of your family in Australia or wherever. My sister used to live in Australia, for example, before she moved back, and we could see pictures of her and her family every day, and things like that. There's also been the dark side of social media, like misinformation, crank theories, superficial distractions, echo chambers. We've seen it particularly in politics of late. Hugely detrimental effects. So all technology has an effect, and we need to take account of the effects that it has on us. And also then, it's worth pointing out that science isn't as omnipotent as we tend to think it is, or as it is presented. So when you read really cutting edge modern physics, for example, and like this guy, Carlo Rovelli, his books are very good. My camera's mirrored, so I can't. Yeah, that's the right way. I can recommend. This is a book about the development of quantum physics, or he has another book called, I think it's called 7 Lessons of Physics, and another one called Reality is Not What It Seems. And in this book, for example, he talks about how what's becoming, and he's not just a writer. He's a quantum. He's exploring quantum gravity as a well-renowned scientist himself. He's pointing out that our whole concept of matter is fundamentally flawed. Our whole idea about matter as something objective in the universe is just fundamentally flawed. And even though science has gone through great lengths to try and keep that illusion, or keep that idea rather, it's just increasingly proving untenable the more science progresses. And instead, what we have is a situation which actually is quite Buddhist in some ways. And he quotes from Buddhist philosophers in an interview I saw with him recently. But the idea that's emerging is that the universe is much more about the relations between things, and between consciousness and matter, for example. All we can know really is the relationships between observers and what they're observing, and events that happen in that relationship. And what reality, like something that might look one way to me, would look something different to you from a scientific point of view. There's no such thing as objective matter, and one person's universe will look completely different to another person's universe. So we can never actually reach whether or not there is objective matter anymore in cutting edge quantum physics. And because you can never really touch it, all you have is your observations of it. It's impossible to say whether it exists or not. All we have is our observations of it, which are fluid and which change from person to person. To quote the great philosopher Brian McGee, he says, "A materialistic view of total reality is a metaphysics, not a scientific theory. There is no possibility whatsoever of scientifically proving or disproving it being, an overarching theory of everything. You simply can't. There's no way science can prove or disprove science in a way. Yeah, it's all based axiomatically on observation." So the full quote for that from Brian McGee is in the book if you want. So anyways, maybe that's more detail about quantum mechanics than you need. But the other big thing about scientism, and I'll stop in a moment after this, is that the view that the universe is a dead one, a materialistic one. It's like a wound up clockwork clock. And again, that's simply a belief. Yeah. And having that belief tends to leave us in quite a nihilistic universe. It has consequences for us, and we run the risk of reducing the beauty and mystery of life in that way. Not always, but we do run that risk. And if life is simply over at death, if life is simply a wound up clock where we have, very little real say in things, we might think we have free will, but that's part of our programming. If you see it in that way, it's a very bleak universe, I would say. And it's quite difficult to have a coherent ethical system in that regard as well. So the best thing you might as well do is to enjoy your life until you die. And that's what life is about then, just simply, listening to the music while the Titanic goes down. Yeah. So I'm being a bit dramatic there, but I think that's the danger that we run when we have these views, and they do affect us then. So that's scientism. Let's see. I think I'll go a little bit further if that's okay. and then we'll have a break, and we'll do a little bit of reflection afterwards. So yeah, I hope that isn't too depressing for you. I do find this kind of fascinating, but I think in a way the purpose of talking about this, just to remind you, is that it's to help us become free of these kinds of views that limit us, actually. So the other part of that is consumerism. So if scientism spells out the universe, consumerism tells us how we can be happy within that universe. And consumerism is the idea that one's well-being and identity is created by the things that we can get and the life experiences we can have. In other words, what we can consume. That's where consumerism comes from. If we can consume these things, these experiences, we will be happy. Yeah. And it also tends to be quite linked to this idea that we can put a price on anything. We can commodify anything. Even spiritual experiences can be commodified. Yeah. And it can be an expression of the uniqueness of who I am. We can be completely happy just by having things. Yeah. But it tends to leave us unhappy, consumerism, because we tend to consume largely because we're existentially bored, or we're unhappy, or we have feelings of incompleteness. And no matter how much we take in, we saw last week about the different types of suffering, and no matter what we have, there will always be some kind of existential anxiety. And if you've heard the story of the Buddha, before the Buddha became the Buddha, he lived with his family in a castle, you could say, or in a palace. And he had to leave the palace because he realized that life as he was living it wasn't going to be enough. So he left the palace and wandered for 6 years or so as a homeless wanderer, and seeking out a path to enlightenment, and eventually became free himself and then passed it on to others. So we have to be prepared to leave our palaces, the palace of consumerism, which perhaps is a little more gaudy than we realize at times. Yeah. So there's lots more that could be said. I mean, with consumerism as well, we can be aware of how a lot of the things that we have because of the suffering of others. So I remember reading about one of the large companies in China, Foxconn, who had to ask people to pledge not to kill themselves because so many people were throwing themselves off the roofs of the factories. Their conditions were so horrible. They even put up nets around the factories to catch people who were trying to kill themselves. And these are people just working in crushing conditions to produce our phones and our technology and our consumer electronics. But also, so much consumerism, it's predicated on a story of growth, of endless growth of the economy. And manufacturing, our economies are built that they always need to expand. And there is a movement towards zero growth economies at the moment in some circles, but it's far from being mainstream yet. So I wanted to give a few quotes here. So there's an Irish author and philosopher called Charles Handy, and he says about economics that economic growth depends ultimately on more and more people wanting more and more of more and more things. Yeah. So our economy fundamentally is based upon more and more people wanting more and more of more and more things. Yeah. And of course, this leads to a corollary statement, which is by one of the environmental ministers to JFK, apparently, who said, Kenneth Boulding is his name, and he said famously that anyone who believes in the indefinite growth of anything physical on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist. So if you believe in indefinite growth of anything physical on a physically finite planet, you're either mad or you're an economist. Yeah. So it's all based upon a story like this, which is untenable longer term, and we're starting to see just how untenable it is, I believe, particularly through the problems with the environment that we're seeing. And the other thing about consumerism, and this is perhaps one of my favorite things to poke people with, is that when you're content, you don't tend to consume as much. Yeah. When you're content, you don't tend to reach for things as much. So what's the immediate corollary of that? The immediate corollary of that is that economies, the marketing and the economy actively cultivates discontent. Yeah, it actively cultivates discontent. Otherwise, you won't buy things. So we're being taken for fools. And one English economist says the precondition of sustained growth is sustained discontent. Yeah. The precondition of sustained growth is sustained discontent. So practicing the Dharma and trying to cultivate contentment, you're actually being an economic threat to the world economy. So you have to so much of what is thrown at us is just to make us feel discontent. Every new phone that's thrown at us, every new fashion, every new piece of clothing that's marketed to us, it's to garner discontent within us. Yeah. And there's a writer called Tim Jackson, and this is one of my favorite quotes. He says, "Consumerism is about us being persuaded to spend money we don't have on things we don't need, to create impressions that don't last on people we don't care about." Yeah, so I'll share that again. Consumerism is about us being persuaded to spend money we don't have on things we don't need, to create impressions that don't last on people that we don't care about. Yeah. So next time you're, mindlessly browsing Amazon, just ask yourself, are you happy to be played for a fool like this? Yeah. Or are you prepared to leave the palace like the Buddha did? Okay, and on that dramatic note, maybe we'll stop. And you can reflect in the tea break about, are you happy to be played for a fool? Yeah, I think I've said enough for now. So I'll make a couple of announcements after the break about what you can do next and so on. But why don't we take a break now and kick off again at 8:15? And if you have any questions or comments, or if you think I'm dangerously subverting the world economy, you can put that in the chat in the meantime, and we'll see you back here in 9 or 10 minutes. The last quote was by someone called Tim Jackson. I don't know much about him, but it's Tim Jackson. Okay, see you in a few minutes. Okay, so some interesting questions coming in. Wow, I don't know if I'll be able to answer these. Amy asks, what does that mean for fashion or art, or, interior design as art? I have no easy answer. I think that in my ideal society, there would be a place for all these kinds of forms of artistic expression. I don't think having an economy is necessarily a problem. And the bit that I'm talking about, it's more the story about what I think I more have the problem with is the story that if we have these things, we will be happy, and the pervasiveness of those stories and the harm that is coming from those stories. So particularly in terms of the damage caused by consumerism, environmentally speaking, just how much we're using basically, and how unsustainable that is. So I think fashion, interior design, they're great. You know what I mean? Absolutely, we should design and have beautiful things, and it's not being fooled by consumerism, I would say, unless, I don't know. I mean, I'm not an artist. Amy, you'd know more than me about this, but I'm sure, museums, galleries, exhibitions often have to find money rather. Sorry, and I'm sure there's a lot of there's corners that need to be cut ethically and things like this. So you have to decide yourself. There's a saying that I like, that if you've no money, you've no spiritual life, because you can't do anything. So we do need to participate in the economy somehow, but it's about trying to keep that as trying to do that on the basis of maybe the Dharma doors rather than the worldly winds, if you see what I mean. I don't think I can answer any more than that, Amy and Kat. Roisin asks about, if consciousness continues after death, could it exist before birth? Could it be something which is ever present, that we only become aware of as conscious human beings and inhabit for a period of our life? Yes. I'm joking, Roisin, but the answer is yes. But the Buddhist view is that when the Buddha gained enlightenment, you can make of this what you will. He looked back. He discovered his previous lives. Okay. And he looked back and back and back and back and back and back, and he couldn't find any prime mover, any first cause, any first life. And the Indian worldview tends to be that there's multiple universes that arise and fall away. So our consciousness has always just gone on and on and on until the Indian view is that enlightenment is where you're breaking that unconscious, going around the merry-go-round again and again and again. You move into something much more positive. I don't in like some Buddhist schools talk about animal consciousness becoming human consciousness and things like this. I think we'll generally stay roughly the same. It takes a lot to change into some other type of consciousness. Can you comment on the prevailing contemporary ideologies as new religions, nationalism, social justice? Yeah, I mean, I think we have to have a critique on nationalism. We have to have a critique on social justice. Is there Buddhist wisdom to do with the worldly winds? Yeah, I mean, we have to have, in a way, you have to critique all stories, Sam. And I mean, like, I think the prevailing ones are consumerism and scientism, but there's also like, one of the things that Buddhists in the West find very uncomfortable is the idea of hierarchy. And in Buddhism, there is the idea of hierarchy, but not in a negative sense, but in the sense of there are some people who are more developed than others. And that is, in some ways, quite controversial in modern times, where, it goes against the grain for some people. But the fact is that some people are going to be more spiritually developed than others, because the Buddha was more spiritually developed than me. And in a way, I'm glad of that. So we have to have a critique on all ideologies or all modern views. Certainly nationalism as well. I mean, Sangharakshita, the founder of our community, is really clear. We need to completely rid ourselves of nationalism. And he distinguishes that from patriotism, which is a more positive state of mind. So not nationalism is like, we're great, we're much better than you. Whereas patriotism is more like, you can really rejoice in the good things about your culture. Is there Buddhist wisdom to do with the worldly winds and fostering communication and harmony in this regard? I'm sure there are, but I just don't have time to go into them right now. Sorry, Sam, we can chat about it again. And Valerie is reading a lot about quantum physics, sonic resonance, the universe being made of plasma. So we're sounds and waves patterns. We are not yeah, okay. Chanting mantras using your voice is believed to keep us in a beneficial vibration. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it can. I don't know much about that, but I don't see why not. Okay. Okay, I think that's it actually. Okay, so a couple of announcements then to make. We're running out of time, but just to say that this is the last week of the course, in case you hadn't noticed. I'm going to ask you to give a bit of thought to what you want to do next. So that can be continuing. Hopefully, it means continuing to practice the Dharma. Yeah, that's what I'd love to see, and I think that's the most radical response we can have to all the modern ideologies or thoughts in the world, and it's not to say that they're all totally bad. In fact, very few of them are totally bad, but we do need to come at it with a dharmic perspective, and particularly the doorways to freedom and the perspective of ever-changingness, insubstantiality and suffering, and so what are you going to do next is the question. And you could decide to keep meditating. You could decide to, I certainly want you to finish the book if you haven't read the book already. But in particular, what I want you to offer you is a way of continuing to explore the Dharma together. So there's various courses that are starting soon in the Buddhist Centre. I'll just mention, these will all go out in the email, which I'll send tomorrow morning, I think. But there's a meditation course. If you don't know how to meditate, there's a meditation course starting this Wednesday night. There's still space on it. 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. if you want to join that. If you've done the meditation course, there's a course exploring the Metta Bhavana, the development of loving kindness meditation. Now, you have to have learned to meditate with us. And that's starting on Tuesday, the 25th of May, with Nyanadhara for, I think it's 5 or 6 weeks. I can't quite remember. And it's called Who Hates the Metta Bhavana? Yeah, so Who Hates the Metta Bhavana? Who hates the development of loving kindness? And then there's a retreat on the bank holiday weekend in June, if you've learned to meditate with us before, called the Gateways of Liberation. And it's exploring those 3 things I mentioned, the 3 characteristics: impermanence, insubstantiality, and dissatisfaction. And then maybe the main one, because it's my one I want to promote, is that on the 14th of June, Monday, I think it's 3 weeks from tonight, I'll be running a new course called The Art of Reflection. And that's a 5-week course exploring how we can reflect well upon the Dharma. Yeah. So you've probably got enough teachings now to reflect upon for the rest of your life. So if you want to learn how to reflect better on those teachings, do come and join me. Many of the team will be here as well, I hope. And it'll be starting on the 14th of June, The Art of Reflection. So I'll share all those in the email later, so you don't have to remember them. And then the last announcement is just to remind you that the course is done completely on a donation basis. So in a way, we're trying to break away from a consumer mentality. We're trying to break away from an exchange of services. We're trying to break away from this all-pervasive consumerism. What we're doing now is we're just offering the Dharma for free. We're offering the Dharma for free to everyone who wants it. And if you want to give back to us to help us to support doing that, that would be great. And that will help smash the system if that's what you want to, how you want to see it. But it would be great if, like, one of the things in our Buddhist community we've always tried to do, and we've succeeded to varying degrees, is just to try and move away from consumer society, a kind of a exchange of services, and just work in terms of mutual generosity. So we give to each other. It's the Dharma doorway of generosity again. So if you're in a position to give to the centre, if you want to support that vision of how we can live in the world, we're suggesting €100 for the course, or give whatever, as much or as little as you want. And if you're not in a position to give financially, that's fine. You've given just by being here and engaging. So that's great too, yeah? Okay, I think that's all my announcements. Okay, so let's see, where are we at? It's 25 past. Maybe we'll do the reflection a little later, and I'll just mention one more section, and then we'll go into groups to check out, okay? So let me just share my screen. There's a lot more content in the book, by the way, that you can read about all this stuff as well. So how do we respond? Sorry, there's a lot more in the book as well about the worldly winds, gain and loss, praise and blame, pleasure and pain, fame and infamy, in relation to the scientism and consumerism. So you can go and read that in the chapter this week again. But I wanted to finish up with, how do we respond to these modern winds? And I wanted to talk in particular about how to live as a Buddhist, how to live a Buddhist life indeed in modern times, and what that requires. So Vajragupta, and he takes these from the founder of our community, Sangharakshita, talks about 4 things that are recommended things to do to live as a voice of sanity in this modern world. Yeah. So the first is we need self-development. Yeah, we need self-development. In a way, everything we've been doing on the course is about self-development. You know, we've learned to focus on our ethical practice. We've learned to meditate and change our minds and shape our minds. We've learned to see things with wisdom. So we need to keep on with this development. If we're not able to be clear and to develop qualities like awareness and kindness and empathy and clarity, we're not going to be of use to the world. We're not going to be a force for good in the world. We're not going to be a use to anyone, never mind ourselves. So in a way, and we're just going to get blown around and lost in the worldly winds. So that's pretty self-evident. I don't need to say much about that. Yeah. Then the second, and this is a bit longer, this is a longer statement, is we need to work at withdrawing support from any kinds of institutions or groups or forces in society that perpetuate a limited materialistic vision. So I hope that doesn't sound too militant or anything like that. I just mean, what I'm saying there is that we need to not actively support stories and views that cause harm, basically. Yeah, we need to try not to actively support stories or views or actions that cause harm. So it's almost impossible not to cause harm. Yeah, it's almost impossible not to cause harm. But we can work at causing less harm and reducing our harm. Yeah. In particular, when it comes to, for example, consumerism, we can work to promote other values other than consumerism, such as mutual generosity, such as we can also promote, when we do have to consume, which we do have to, doing so as ethically as possible. You know, shopping ethically, investing ethically, working ethically, and so on. You know, we can critique the systems that are around us, but we can also critique ourselves. It's not just that we look at greed and delusion in bankers and so on, investment bankers and stock market moguls and things like this. We also need to look at our own actions and how that affects the world, obviously, as well. And there's lots of things we can do here. To mention two or three, we could, one of the big ones these days is look at how we get our information. Where do we get our information from? How much information do we need? How much is useful? And what are truly reliable and truthful sources to get our information from? I think that's a really important one. Do we go online to participate in the outrage machine that is social media, or are we genuinely interested in the truth? And that's a really tricky one. I mean, for example, many of you came to the centre because we run Facebook ads, for example, and I think Facebook is a terrible institution on the whole, and at the same time, it's something we have to participate in if we want to reach people. So it is a really tricky one. These are really tricky areas to work out what's best to do, and one that you'll have to just work on to get better at. Another example here would be to become more vegetarian or to become more vegan. Which, in a way, by not being vegetarian and to another degree as well, not being vegan, you're kind of asking people to cause suffering to animals. You're asking someone to kill animals for you, for example, and would we be prepared to kill those animals ourselves, for example, if we were going to eat them? And there's the suffering of animals as sentient beings. And also a huge amount of the world's carbon footprint comes from animal production and animal killing and meat production, basically. And also then just reduce your consumption. The consumer marketplace is one of the biggest contributors to carbon emissions, to climate change, and so on. And one of the things we can do here is live on the basis of a really positive simplicity, rather than on a vision of craving and desire and shortage. So often, sometimes when I think about climate change, I think that we'll all have to end up living in a cave somewhere, feeling guilty for farting and stuff like this, because we're contributing to greenhouse gases. But actually, I think we have to have a really positive vision of what simplicity is. So Sangharakshita has a lovely saying, which you might have heard me say on other courses before. He says, "The truly simple life glows with significance. For its simplicity is not the dead simplicity of a skeleton, but the living simplicity of a flower or a great work of art." So I'll read that again. "The truly simple life glows with significance, for its simplicity is not the dead simplicity of a skeleton, but the living simplicity of a flower or a great work of art." So when we talk about living simply, we don't mean necessarily a life of suffering and denial, but rather getting away from what's not important so that what's truly important can shine through. So what's truly important can shine through. So the third one then is about speaking out. So critiquing, like we said earlier, critiquing limited ideologies and communicating real vision and values. So not being afraid to speak out when we have the chance to do so. Having a critique, always kind of questioning, is this a partial vision that I have, a partial story? For example, even just simply, is this thing going to make me happy? This thing that I'm craving, that I'm putting all this energy into. Am I actually going to read that book that looks so shiny, or is it just going to sit on my bookshelf gathering dust? And we don't have to become like a rabid Buddhist preacher or anything like that. It's more that we can just speak our minds and question things and get into the interesting discussions with people about this stuff. And, we can talk to our family, our friends, our children, whoever, about the value of having this kind of ethical outlook on things, rather than just being a mindless consumer. And you can be sure as well that if we're not talking to our friends and our family and our children about having an ethical outlook on life, someone else is, and someone else probably is promoting an ethical, a not very ethical, consumeristic outlook on it. So be it advertising or the internet or whatever. So that's the third one, speaking out. And then the last one is joining a spiritual community and helping it to grow. So it's really difficult to work on our own. It's really difficult for one person to make a massive change in the world. And we need people around us to, in some ways, concretize what we think and feel. We need to express what we think and feel to other people. Otherwise, it becomes more, or it remains more of an idea. It's never really fully actualized until we communicate it to others. So we need people around us who share our vision and our goals and our values. At least some of the time we need those people around us. And this is what a spiritual community is. We call it a Sangha in Buddhism. Sangha means spiritual community. And it's really central in Buddhism down through the ages from the time of the Buddha. And I think also when we're with other people, when we work together with other people, our efforts get magnified and shine out much more strongly than if we're just working on our own. And also it's just so much more enjoyable and so much more supportive to work with other people. I was saying at the start of the night that I've really enjoyed this course, and part of the reason I've enjoyed this course is that the team has been much bigger and I've been working with more people than on other courses that I typically do. So it is just a really good thing to do, to work with other people. So do what you can to join a spiritual community. And it's a bit difficult with lockdown, but really what the Dublin Buddhist Centre is trying to do is build a community of people based upon shared values and beliefs. Yeah. And as doing that as a force for good in the world, so that we can positively impact the world. So there are Vajragupta's 4 things. Let me just put them up on the screen again. Self-development. We need self-development. We need to withdraw our support from, anything that perpetuates a limited and materialistic view, like scientism, like consumerism. We need to speak out and critique things, and we need to join and help a spiritual community to grow. And you help a spiritual community to grow really by just participating, by turning up and engaging and sharing. Yeah. Okay. So that's all of the content for the course, indeed. What I'd like us to do now is we'll do a short reflection, and then we'll go into reporting out groups, and then that'll be it. So why don't we'll have a chance to ask questions as well if you want. So why don't we just set ourselves up to, I think we've had more than enough content tonight, so apologies for the amount of content. Why don't we set ourselves up and just, we'll do a short reflection. So when you're ready, closing your eyes and taking a deeper breath or two. And if we're in any way heady, you can bring yourself down into your body, breathing down into your belly. And in this reflection, we're just going to throw our mind back over the whole course, just to remind us and to gather all the different nights of the course together. Gather up all the momentum we've gained throughout the course. So we came together a few weeks ago. And I should say, as we do this, it can be helpful to stay in touch with the breath if you want, if it's helpful, the breath down in the belly. So yeah, we gathered together here a few weeks ago, 5 weeks ago or so. And we were introduced to the worldly winds, praise and blame, gain and loss, fame, infamy, pleasure and pain. So one of the first things we did was to become aware of and name the worldly winds. And we might bring to mind our experiences of doing that over the weeks, particularly when we first came across them. And we looked at distinguishing control from influence, recognizing where we could change a situation and where we had to just let go and accept. We looked at how we can see the wins as opportunities rather than obstacles, looking for the Dharma doors of generosity, of mindfulness, of individuality, of truthfulness. We looked at being aware of the stories we tell ourselves, stories that can be unhelpful and stories that can be helpful, and how stories can lead us to being really caught up in the worldly winds more fully, and stories that can help us become free of the worldly winds, and recognizing all those stories. We looked at developing equanimity, particularly in meditation, that spiritual robustness that gives us shelter from the winds. We looked at how we can see the winds of change, taking the wisdom perspective, seeing how the worldly winds are always changing, they never last, and letting go into the freedom of seeing that. And then tonight we looked at Western modern winds, particularly winds like scientism, consumerism, materialism. And we looked at how Buddhist practice is about creating a better world. And we had suggestions about how we could do that. So having recalled how we got on in the course and all the different parts, seeing if we can form a resolution now to take off the course. What are you going to practice this week? What are you going to do next? And make it quite specific rather than a general, vague statement. And just one or two things. And then how are we going to remember to do that? How are we going to remind ourselves to do that in the coming days? So just taking a note of how you might remind yourself to do this each day or whenever the time it is for that to happen. And when you're ready, then you can start to let go of the reflection and just sit for a few moments, just sitting with how you're feeling right now. How is your body? How is your heart? How is your mind? When you're ready, then being aware of the room around you, the sounds, and reintroducing movement, wiggling fingers and toes, and bringing the practice to a close. Okay, so what we'll do now is we'll go back into groups for maybe, let's go in for 12 minutes, Stephen. And what I want you to do is maybe just go around and each of you just say how you found the course. And depending on how many people are in your group, you can spend longer or shorter on that, and what you want to do next or what you want to bring off the course. Yeah. So I think Stephen can put us directly into the groups. If you dropped out of Zoom, we might need to put you back in again. So whenever you're ready, Stephen, for 11 or 12 minutes. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so I think that's it. So I hope your group went well. I just want to say one or two last things. Firstly, I want to thank all the team for hosting the groups and being so good at doing that. So those are, I want to thank Kelly, who can't make it tonight, Matthew, Greta, Sam, Oscar, Catherine, David, Amy, and Kieran for hosting the groups. It's been lovely working with you all, and you've really given yourself. There's no benefit apart from making the world a better place. And I also want to thank Stephen Shortall, who's up there in my top left corner along the top. So Stephen's been doing all the tech, and that's possibly the hardest part of this course. You have to worry about all the groups going okay and technology not crashing and everything. So big thanks to Stephen. He's a wonderful man. We got to go for a walk this week. It was great catching up with him. So thanks, Stephen. And I look forward to doing more courses with you all. And then finally, just to say thank you to all of you as well for turning up. Like I said, I really enjoyed it. I don't just say that every course. I do enjoy every course, but this has been one of the most enjoyable courses I've done. And a lot of it, I guess I should thank Vajrashura as well, because it is a really good book, his book, and yeah, it's been very, very good material. But anyways, a big thank you to you all for turning up and engaging, and I hope I see you soon. And I'll stop the recording now, and